In this video, I show you how life got started only using the chemical reactions that life uses today. Now, life started a long time ago, in the prehistoric times of more than, according to my theory, more than 4 billion years ago. The main basic thing that researchers are unable to do at this time is figure out how the first cell started, how all the components within a cell evolved to be inside a membrane. Now, the cells, all cells have a membrane. But what is the purpose of the membrane? A lot of researchers believe it's to keep the chemical reactions from diluting in the ocean and being unable to react. A lot of them believe that it's to protect the chemical reactions from the outside environment. Now, that's true today. The membrane does that function of protecting and keeping its internal components from diluting and allowing, regardless of the environment, those chemical reactions are occurring inside the cell. The key difference, the key thing that people forget to do is to realize how the membrane does that. Now, according to Biology 101, everybody knows the membrane maintains homeostasis. Homeostasis is to keep the conditions within the cell in the proper levels to allow that cell to continue to live and continue to do the reactions it does. Now you have cells that live in different environments and their membrane has to work in different manners to maintain those conditions in there. But how does the cell do it? The cell membrane. The cell membrane does that by, one, keeping water, excess water, out. Because if too much water went in, the cell would explode. So it has proteins that allow it to do that. Take water in, take water out. Another thing that is required for the cell membrane to do is to keep the pH at a certain level that allows those components within the cell to work. And this is the key question. How does it maintain that pH? How does it control the pH internally when the pH externally might be different? What does the cell's proteins on the membrane have to do to maintain that pH? That pH is very important because that pH allows the certain proteins to work within that medium. If the pH goes too high or too low, those proteins lose their shape and will no longer work. So the pH is very important because the pH of this particular cell needs to be at a particular point so its proteins will take its proper conformation and work within the cell. How does the membrane maintain the pH? It maintains it by controlling the amount of carbon dioxide within the cell's cytoplasm. The cell has proteins that eject or carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide, once it reacts with water, takes a different conformation, but it makes the water acidic. That's carbon dioxide's number one thing. It's the number one problem we have today, is that we are changing the atmosphere and creating a more acidic ocean. To the point where cytoskeletons and shells are unable to form because the water is too acidic, causing those substances not to be able to form. That's not the point that I find amazing. What I find amazing is that the ocean's acidity increases so much when the carbon dioxide level is at a 0.0035% of the world's atmosphere. That is how much carbon dioxide it takes to acidify the ocean. Now, as we know, the only reason we have oxygen in our atmosphere and so little carbon dioxide is thanks to photosynthetic organisms that take the carbon dioxide out of the air and use it to produce energy by photosynthesis and release oxygen. And it did that so much for billions of years that it completely changed our atmosphere, where there's an overabundance of oxygen, which allows us to live, and very little carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which allows the ocean to be less acidic and more basic, let's say, alkaline. So, that being the case, photosynthetic life changed the ocean, because at the beginning there was no oxygen. And they believe that the carbon content of the atmosphere back at the beginning of life was at least 10%, if not more. I personally think it was more, but 10% is great for me. 10% of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at 10 atmospheres, which geologists don't agree yet, but they believe that the atmosphere was much heavier at that time, which was 10 to 400 times atmospheric pressure compared to today. Now, the atmospheric pressure is very important because that affects the ocean at that time in a very particular way. Now, at that time, the atmosphere had at least 10% carbon dioxide. These are carbon dioxide molecules. And I would assume that the nitrogen level was the same, or maybe even more than it is today. Those are nitrogen molecules. So what there was no oxygen. And the carbon content was particularly high. Like I said, minimum 10%. Gravity and the content of the atmosphere caused the pressure of the atmosphere on the ocean to be at least 10 atmospheres than it is from today. Now, according to the research I've done, I have a degree in chemistry, and what I've read in my text is that carbon dioxide over water at 10 atmospheres makes the water acidic to the pH of 3.45. That's pretty acidic. But here's the thing. All research that I've read, prior to mine, of course, talks about the ocean's average pH at that time. The average pH of the ocean does not elucidate anything about what couldn't happen in the ocean at that time. And the reason why I believe that is because carbon dioxide reacts with water in a very particular way. The part that is most acidic, or the part that the carbon dioxide has the most effect on, is at the surface. At the surface, there'll be a greater concentration of carbon dioxide from the atmospheric pressure. But here's a very important thing that occurs. The deeper you go, the less effect the carbon of the atmosphere has on the water's pH. The pH tends to be less drastic the deeper you go into the ocean. The deeper you go into the ocean, the pH will start to climb. The deeper you go, the less effect the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has on the pH of the ocean. So the ocean's pH begins to climb the deeper you go into the ocean. It gets to the point where you go deep enough, not only that barely any light gets down there from the sun, very little effect of the atmospheric carbon dioxide has on the water. And of course, knowing that volcanic vents have been in work since the beginning of time, it will get to the point where the water will be more alkaline, at a pH approaching 12 or 13. Due to the proximity of these alkaline sources. So you're going to have a very, very broad range of pH gradient within the ocean. So you're going to have more acidic ocean at the top, closer to the surface, where more of the effect of the atmosphere occurs, and less so going down. Why is that important? Very important. Because this creates, around the globe, with its complete coverage of water, a pH gradient all around the world. So all along the surface of the entire globe will be the same and equal pH. Of course, because the atmospheric pressure all around the globe will be the same. It might vary, of course, according to weather, but overall be within a very small range. It'll be constant pressure and a constant amount of carbon dioxide for billions of years until the photosynthetic organisms take over and change the atmosphere forever. Or at least until today. Why is this important? Why is this gradient in the oceans around the world important. The mystery of how you can get a membrane to maintain homeostasis is something that I believe is not a problem for the origin of life. The origin of life did not need a membrane to control the pH. Instead of thinking of one small area and controlling the pH so chemical reactions can occur, I think a better solution is to move the chemicals from one pH to another pH using the currents of the ocean. According to oceanography, the current in the ocean has been in motion since the beginning of the oceans. The oceans do not only work, the currents of the ocean do not only work with convection, meaning heat. The heat of the sun warms them up and then it cools and then causes currents. No. A large effect also occurs due to the rotation and the gravity of the Earth. As the Earth rotates and its gravity holds the water to its surface, that causes the water to circulate in bands and cause currents within that ocean that will constantly flow regardless if the sun is hot or not. So why is this important? Because even at the beginning of the Earth, when the sun wasn't very powerful, let's say it was a little bit reddish because it wasn't putting out that much yet, that wasn't necessary for life to occur. The energy to cause the reactions that started life to occur would come from the currents passing material through these different gradients. Now, life creates energy now. The very famous Krebs cycle. The way it works is with very complex proteins causing the production of lots of ATP. But the important thing that occurs within the mitochondria is that it has dual membranes within itself, peppered with these proteins that produce ATP. How does that happen? When the mitochondria gets sugar, it takes that molecule, breaks it apart. Most of the energy of that molecule goes into passing protons from one membrane to the other, meaning the pH of this liquid is reduced and is increased here so that those hydrogen molecules, which are what creates the pH gradient, passes through these proteins from one high concentration to a lower concentration. That flow of hydrogen through those proteins, the current of these hydrogens through those proteins, is what causes ATP to be generated. It's the flow of hydrogen, current, through these proteins that create ATP. Now, if you can see that there was already a gradient in the oceans, you could see that energy could easily be created by passing the proteins or the molecules through these gradients and causing chemical reactions to occur. Now, here's the ticket. Not just any organic chemical reactions to occur, which is what I thought at the beginning of my theory, back in 2004. But instead, life would have used, or nature at that point, because life hadn't existed yet, a very versatile molecule that life still uses today, that is abundantly available today in meteorites and asteroids, and was most certainly delivered in mass quantities by the massive late bombardment. Which molecule are we talking about? It's a molecule that is very versatile. It creates structures automatically once you chain them together. A molecule that is readily available from outer space, delivered by meteorites. A molecule that allows itself to work on itself to change into other molecules that life can use. A molecule that is readily produced anytime you put any type of chemical together. These molecules will be produced. And it's a molecule that life uses regardless of what pH it finds itself in. Life doesn't need to be in any particular pH for these molecules to work. Certain organic chemical reactions that some origin of life researchers use need particular conditions that need to occur over and over again to work. And a lot of times they don't even work in the pristine conditions of a lab. So here these molecules can work in any pH and work on themselves to create other molecules, and are readily available anywhere you go, and are readily available by any means once you put any chemicals together and react them. Now here's another point, which I think is very, very important. Life did not use organic chemistry in conditions that it cannot use proteins. Instead of the conditions changing and life using other molecules to do the same work, it uses the same molecules in different configuration and in different sequences, so it can work in that other environment, in that other pH. All it does is, instead of dropping that molecule and taking up other types of molecules to work at a different pH, all it does is reorder those molecules in a way that once it reaches that pH, that molecule will work at that pH, because the shape it conforms to will only work in that pH. Let me do the big reveal now and not keep you waiting any longer. That molecule, that modular Lego-like molecule, is of course amino acids. Now, by weight, this was one of the most abundant chemicals found in the majority of chondrite meteorites. This molecule is found in almost every asteroid, almost every meteorite examined by astrophysicists. There's 70 different types that they have detected in chondrite meteorites. Life only uses 20. So we had abundance of different types of amino acids that nature could have used to get the process started, even more than now. But that's neither here nor there. The point is that amino acids are this wonderful molecule that is readily available, that works in any pH, that works on itself. And what do I mean by that? What does life do when it consumes other life forms? When it eats? It does not break down the food to its molecular suborganic components. It doesn't break them down to the elemental components. It breaks them down no further than amino acids. Amino acids is what the body uses to fuel itself, to repair itself, to replicate, to get the material it needs to continue to exist. Whenever any organic process to build a molecule within any cell, it always starts with an amino acid. The proteins, which are constructed from amino acids, take an amino acid and change it into the molecule that organism is going to need. It takes amino acids, transforms them so that another protein can take that molecule and then add another amino acid that it processes to form a completely different molecule that will be beneficial to that cell. It does not take organic chemicals and produce organic chemicals from inorganic elements. It always transforms amino acids into another molecule so that it can be processed and used by the cell. That tells me that it's more easy for amino acids to organize and use themselves to make other molecules to get the ball rolling. Life today starts with an amino acid and transforms an amino acid into a precursor of RNA. It does not take some other molecules from the environment that are closely related to RNA and transforms them into RNA. No, it takes readily available amino acids from food, transforms it into a pre-RNA molecule by one protein, and then once that protein is done with the amino acids and transforms it, another protein comes and takes it to the next step to produce a second pre-RNA molecule, and so forth and so on until finally one other protein creates an RNA molecule. But it always starts, and subsequent steps continue to use amino acids in life today. So, years gone by, 50 years ago or more, they could have figured out how amino acids would organize and create proteins that were functional. Why? Because whenever they would put amino acids together, they would form a jumble of amino acids, and the probability of the amino acid spontaneously taking the form of the proteins that our life uses today are astronomical. And I agree, and that's correct. But the key is that the different types of cells, animal, plant, protozoa, fungal, archaea, all use different protein sequences in the proteins that create RNA. If you didn't get that, the protein for animals to create RNA are different than the proteins used by plants, are different than proteins used by protozoa, are different than proteins used by fungal. The sequence of amino acids that these proteins use to make RNA are up to 45% different. 45% different. In modern technology, if anything's more than 10% in error, it's unusable. It will not link up, it will not communicate, it will be detrimental. So, how is life able to use proteins that have a sequence of amino acids that are up to 45% different to create the exact same type of RNA molecule? That is the key. That is the step they missed. That is the key problem that they did not address, that I did, and led me to this solution. Again, we return to the protein gradient. Amino acids, the 20 at least, that life uses, are activated at different pHs. They're activated and bond to each other in very different sequences depending in what pH solution they find themselves in. At a certain pH, some amino acids are active, others are not. The ones that are active at this pH will bind to each other, but these others will not. When the current takes these down, these will not react any longer, but these that did not previously react will now bind to that string of molecules. Because the currents never cease and have been going for billions of years, they will constantly take these magical molecular Legos and pass them through these pH over and over again over the millions and billions of years for this to keep occurring. The elongation. Now I hear people crying out, no, the oceans were too diluted. The dilution problem. Sorry. Carbon dioxide again. There's enough of it in the ocean and enough amino acids and other molecules to make the ocean consistent with the internal part of modern cells. Very comparable. You got to think about it. Back then, there was no oxygen. The alkalinity of the ocean was regulated to the bottom. But the majority of the ocean was acidic in a very particular way, remember. More acidic towards the surface, less so the more deeper you go. The cycling of this amino acids will create longer and longer chains. And as amino acids grow, they take on particular shapes. Alpha helix and beta sheets. Every protein that is catalytic in life today uses these two structures to form their catalytic centers, or clefts, so that these repeating structures, regardless of their sequence, all amino acids can form either a helix or beta sheet depending on the sequence. But here's the thing. Almost all amino acids that can form a helix can also form a beta sheet, and vice versa. It depends on the conformation once they're united. But here's the thing. The reason why these proteins of these different lives can still form a functioning RNA molecule is because they all possess, although different sequences of amino acids, they all possess almost the exact same shapes in their proteins. Their proteins are shaped almost exactly the same based on helix, alpha helixes, and beta sheets. And that is the reason why the sequence can be up to 45% different. Because regardless of the sequence, they'll still either form a helix or a beta sheet. What's important for the activation of these proteins to take amino acids and produce RNA is the shape of their active centers. It's only very few amino acids that need to be the same in these reactive centers and clefts to cause that reaction to occur. That's why the rest of the protein all around it, as long as it contains the same shapes, it doesn't matter what sequence those amino acids are. If they're holding the same shape enough to hold a few amino acids to form the same reactive center. That is the key. That is going to take another video solely dedicated to explaining how that occurs. But the currents taking amino acids delivered by meteorites is absolutely the way it started. Here's another thing. A very important PhD student by the name, I believe her name is Jennifer Blank, created an experiment to demonstrate the probability of the survival of amino acids delivered by comets. That if the amino acids contained in comets would survive the high velocity, high energy impact of comets slamming into the Earth. How did she do that experiment? She got amino acids, water to represent the ice, encapsulated it in a metal capsule, and then use a cannon to cause a high impact to simulate the high impact of a comet hitting the Earth. What was the result of these experiments? These proteins, instead of breaking down into their elemental components, the majority of them formed short chains of amino acids. Some of them pretty long too. She showed a model in a picture. I'll show you that in the future. But instead of breaking down, they combined. The energy of the impact, instead of breaking them down, combined them. Why is this important? This experiment, to me, emulates the condition of the oceans at that time. Water and amino acids in abundance. So that it doesn't matter if a meteorite striking the oceans had amino acids in it. The oceans themselves had amino acids. And whenever any iron or rocky meteorite struck the ocean, it would recreate this scenario and form longer chains of amino acids, with the millions and billions of meteorites containing or not containing amino acids striking the ocean would further create more chains and more proteins of amino acids. That is fantastic evidence that this scenario is very, very probable. That experiment, although she was just testing the effects of comet impacts on Earth, the experiment she designed also assists my theory of amino acids forming chains in the ocean. So I believe that the heavy bombardment, instead of hindering life formation, it assisted life in forming much faster. Because the Earth did eventually get to the point where it had large amounts of ocean. That ocean and its water is believed to be delivered by the heavy bombardment. And according to my theory and that experiment, the heavy bombardment assisted the Earth and the ocean to create molecules from amino acids that took amino acids to create RNA, because those long chains would always form either a helix or a beta sheet and get together and form RNA. Here's another key thing. When you look at the less evolved life forms, meaning lower forms of life than animal or plants, or even protozoa, when you go to archaea, for example, E. coli in our own gut. E. coli uses short chains of RNA molecules working together to form a larger protein to take another amino acid and change it to RNA. Again, backing up this scenario. Today, it has not evolved a larger protein. It uses smaller chains of amino acids to form one larger protein to then take amino acids, and through several steps and several different proteins that also unite from smaller chains to create RNA. Again, a scenario that is very similar to what I believe occurred prior to biology in the prebiotic oceans. This scenario, I believe, is what started life. I think that'll do for right now. I really hope this opens your eyes to a different scenario than what's been researched and put out. And as you can see, no special conditions were necessary. All of this is proven reactions that occur today in life that have been positively resultant experiments, both within the cell, the ocean today with the acidification. You can see that the coral reefs are on the surface. They are the ones who are bleached more. And this scenario is very, very possible. And this is a scenario I believe that started life on Earth. I'm going to be producing more videos to examine the different components of this theory, so I can go in more detail on exactly what happened in each step, and hopefully convince you, as I've convinced myself, that this is the way life started. My book's available in the description below. If you feel that I present a very plausible scenario, I hope you take a look at my book and read the details and the figures I've drawn. And I've used figures from other research articles that demonstrate the certain steps. In my book, I use 14 different articles from 8 different fields, none of which have to do with origin of life research. These are all different fields that show positive results in their fields that